Hey, everybody. I am Jacob Winograd. I am the host of the Biblical Anarchy podcast and host for you tonight, back here again live in the LCI Greenroom. Sorry we had a little bit of a hiatus that was sort of unplanned. I came down with one of those, winter mystery viruses where you're like, is it the flu? Is it COVID? Is it something else? I don't even bother to go and pay the whatever it costs to go get tested because I don't really think it changes my getting well regimen. So when we're past the point of being required to do so, I still have a lot of PTSD from those days, though. Remember, there was a family gathering where everyone was saying, like, well, we need you to get a positive or an all clear test like several days before. Anyway, reliving that stuff. But I'm on the mend now. We are going to do tonight's show. I'll be back again tomorrow night with our founder, Norman Horn, and we'll give you a little bit of up to date, sort of like current things going on at LCI, talking about what we're going to be doing next year as well. And I, of course, want to plug again our end of the year fundraiser. We're about, I'd say, close to halfway, which is kind of how these things go. Usually there's like one of those uh what's the word I'm looking for here in geometry? Is it parabola? Is that right? Like that little kind of starts out slow and then at the end it all shoots up, and that's sort of how end of the year fundraising goes for nonprofits. But if you want to support what we do here at LCI and have your donation matched dollar for dollar between now and the end of December, you can go to libertarianchristians.com/donate, which is there on the bottom ticker for those of you who are watching live. And of course, if you're on the audio side and you're listening before the end of 2025, you can still donate as well. Appreciate all of the support that you guys have given us. We've grown steadily every year since I've been involved, and it started. If you don't know the history of LCI, which maybe I can talk to Norm about this tomorrow. I mean, it literally just started out as a website, and we've had a lot of growth over the last few years, launching Christians for Liberty Network, launching the live show a couple years ago. We have books coming out. We had 3 books come out this past year, which I actually have those right next to me. We had this one, What Do Libertarian Christians Believe?, which pairs nicely with the Faith Seeking Freedom flagship book, which the second edition, as I've said many times now, is coming out next year. And my name will be on the author byline next year for the second edition. So that'd be pretty cool. And then, of course, we have House Divided. I already mentioned COVID, and this was our book about COVID, technology, worship, and healing. The church after COVID. This was sort of like you could say like a reflection on what the church got wrong and kind of understanding what the purpose of church is in the wake of the COVID lockdowns. The third book, I don't have a copy on me right now, but it was The Anarchist Anabaptist, which was written by our own Cody Cook, on just the sort of historical connection between the radical Reformation and libertarian anarchist thought. But of course, we're very ecumenical here at LCI. I am the weird mutt because I'm a Reformed Baptist. So I'm like a low church with a high church theology, or mid church theology, I should say. We have Eastern Orthodox with Mike Meharry, who used to host the Anarchy podcast, and he's, of course, with the 10th Amendment Center. We have a Wesleyan and Alex Bernardo. We have true Reformed, like Presbyterians in Kerry Baldwin and Greg Baus. We have Church of Christ and our founder, Norman Horn. The one thing we do not have, as far as staffed on LCI, which I hope maybe this changes one day, is a Catholic. And I've always loved my Catholic brothers and sisters. We did partner with Ryan McMakin for a panel back at Freedom Fest a couple of years ago, who was a Catholic. But I had my friend Zach on, who's a Catholic, last month for a conversation. And tonight I'm joined by another friend of mine who is also a Catholic and a libertarian. She's also a political activist. And we're going to have a conversation tonight about, well, everything. We're going to have a conversation about political activism, about immigration, about Trump's first year, and about Catholicism and the moral teaching of the ethical, I believe it's, the consistent ethic of life. which I'm very excited to get into that topic. So I'm going to go ahead and bring my guest up now. It is Amity Dolby. Amity, how are you doing tonight? Oop, sorry, you are muted. Let me unmute you. There you go.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm really excited about our conversation. And in alignment with your show teaser, I intend to make the case that Catholics are the best anarchists in world history.
Okay, awesome. Well, I'm excited to get into that. It's one of those things where I feel like there is a really, really strong case for Catholics to be libertarian, even if you just end up in that minarchist camp. But I feel like there is this misnomer with, well, both Catholics and non-Catholics regarding if they can be anarchists or not, which I know there was someone, I guess like a follower of yours, who was saying something on X before the show, and I was asking him what he thinks anarchy is. I forget his name, but of course we know that there are quite a few prominent Catholic anarchists in the movement. Like there's Tom Woods, and then J.R. Tolkien, the writer of Lord of the Rings, is also a Catholic, and he in his writings basically said that he viewed himself as an anarchist. So it's not like this completely unprecedented thing. I guess there's just some like association, like, oh well, they like I wouldn't say this. Some people would be like, well, they worship the Pope and they, submit to the church authority being maximum, so they can't be anarchist. I, of course, would, I think that's a very low tier sort of criticism. But before we get into any of that, you and I have interacted several times now. We were on Larry Sharp's show together, we were on Free's show together, but this is your first time in the green room. So if you could go ahead and just give yourself an introduction for our audience here at LCI, just your background, anything that you want to plug, things that you've done. I know you've been active in the Libertarian Party and libertarian space. So go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm a lifetime member of the Libertarian Party National. I'm a former board member of my local affiliates, two of them, and the Libertarian Party of Virginia. I'm currently not involved in local politics. I'm transitioning from LP Virginia to LP Florida. So right now I'm just, doing activism online. I have my X channel at Amity 13, where I love to discuss issues of liberty. I grew up in a Republican household and transitioned into libertarianism, minarchism, and I'm well on my way to anarchism. So.
And when did you, I think I did this with Free when he was on, so maybe you remember this bit. Whenever I have someone new on, I always make the joke that like we have to tell our libertarian origin story like we're recovering statists, right? So it's like Alcoholics Anonymous, but for libertarians. So when did you first become a libertarian?
Well, like I said, I grew up in a Republican household, a very conservative Christian household, Protestant, by the way. And in early 2000s, when I was in my 20s, I was a new homeowner, a new business owner, a landlord, and the government wanted their pound of flesh. There were payroll taxes and property taxes and, all this stuff. And, here I was just trying to feed my kids, and the government was taking so much of it. And so I really began to hate the government, at that point. And then that was right around the time of 9/11. And it seemed like, we were going to wars that didn't make sense. George Bush was talking about, overthrowing Saddam Hussein when he really had nothing to do with 9/11. And, it was all about our freedoms. But I didn't really buy into all that. So that started me on the journey of libertarianism. I didn't actually become a libertarian until after seeing how the Republican Party treated Ron Paul in the primaries. And, everybody has a Ron Paul story, but I became a libertarian officially in 2013.
Awesome. Yeah, I I didn't become a libertarian until 2018, and I missed the Ron Paul boat, but I do remember, because I came from the left. I was a Democrat, and I remember thinking back then, just kind of like, I didn't agree with anything from Ron Paul except war, and I just was like, well, that figures. Like the Republican Party, of course. Like I was like I was having a kind of black pill at the moment, but a sort of red pill, white pill moment in retrospect, when simultaneously I remember watching the Republican Party screw Ron Paul over, and I saw the Democratic Party screw Bernie Sanders over, who I was supporting back in 2015, 2016.
Right.
So it definitely soured me on both major parties. And then I went through, after Trump was elected, a little political sojourn and found libertarianism. And I went straight to anarchism, though. I didn't do the whole, 6 months of a minarchist like the joke goes. But I was going to ask you, which I think you already answered, if you were a cradle Catholic, but you said you were actually raised Protestant. So I guess now I'm curious, when did you find yourself drawn to the submission to the Bishop of Rome?
Well, in my adult life, I was actually, as an infant, I was baptized in the Presbyterian Church, but I mainly grew up Methodist. And so in my adult life, I was seeking my own faith, and I actually got into ministry in the Methodist Church. And as I was studying scripture, I started developing a more fundamental, literal interpretation of scripture, which led me to the Church of Christ. And after a few years of ministering to women and children, writing Bible studies for the Church of Christ, I decided that that was not the theological avenue that I was really seeing in scripture. There were some things that, I really didn't agree on. And so for a while, I just ended up in a kind of generic evangelical mega church. I was a vocalist on the worship team. I was doing prison ministry. And in 2022, I started thinking, I'm actually a genealogist by hobby. And I was thinking of my family history, and I was thinking, I don't know any history about the church itself from, before the Reformation. I had never really studied it or anything. So
Yeah.
I began studying the early church fathers, and then I started reading the Catechism of the Catholic Church. And those two things in concert with scripture just really made sense to me. And so I was confirmed in the Catholic Church Easter Vigil of 2023.
Okay, wow. Man, you've really, while you were listing your journey there, I was like, you almost checked the boxes of like the representation we have here at LCI. I was spelling out at the beginning of all the different people we have here. You baptized Presbyterian, and then raised Methodist, and then Church of Christ, and then Catholic. That's interesting. I now this is the part where like the my Protestants will expect me to come in and like start doing like debates and stuff like that, which I'm not going to do. I actually, so I was raised evangelical, but like in the weird I'm trying to think of a non-profanic way to describe this. In the very awkward child of sort of like charismatic and Pentecostal churches that were very popular in like the 80s and 90s, and they were also very dispensational. So I was raised in a very bizarre church environment, and it kind of soured me on church. And I was still a Christian, but I just like I was kind of I ended up staying at like the church that the last, because we went like from church to church for a while. Then the last church that my parents took us to before they got divorced, I just kept going to, but I did it more out of like comfortability and liking the people there. I didn't really agree with their theology. They were more like I am now, Reformed Baptist. But then when I went through my political sojourn, I then went through a theological one, and so I ended up obviously in the more Reformed camp, not Presbyterian, because although the issue I disagree with Presbyterians on is the one that you're going to agree with them on, which is infant baptism. But other than that, I ended up in the Reformed camp. But I during that time, I also studied a lot of church history, and I continue to do that. And something that I think that I do a lot differently than a lot of Reformed and Protestants is that I try to be very ecumenical with Catholics and Eastern Orthodox, because I think that in order for you to even make the Protestant claim, you have to do that in a way that isn't like no shade to my restorationist like Church of Christ brothers and sisters, but like I don't agree with the claim that would say that basically at some point the church just like disappeared or died out and we had to start over. I think you do have to make some kind of claim that throughout the all of history since Christ ascended, that even though the church has, and you would certainly agree, even as a Catholic, the church has gone through different periods where, like there was like the Arian crisis where it felt like true Christianity was under attack within the church, but the church was preserved. And even like in the, I have to believe that even about the church in, the 1200s and the 1400s and, up until the Protestant Reformation. I have to be able to look at it and say, even if I think there were errors, even if I think that there was a need for a reformation, to me, reformation means like, you're fixing something that is correct, that has to almost be like, restored or corrected for. But I don't like when Protestants do this thing where they act like the Catholic Church ceased to be Christian, and B, they continue that today, and sort of like exaggerating or exemplifying or focusing on the differences we have in theology, when at the end of the day, like a Protestant and a Catholic have way more in common than say like a either of us have with Mormonism or with Islam or with like, I think we're still part of the same religion. Anyway, those are my thoughts just in terms of just like the general like Protestantism versus Catholicism. Like to me, it's kind of as silly as doing, which I know we're going to talk about anyway, but it's kind of as silly as doing the like hardcore anarchy versus minarchist libertarian purity in fighting. It's not that I don't have like opinions on these things, but it's just kind of like there's a certain energy that those conversations have to be done in, I think, where it's like, hey, this is an in-house conversation, not like we're deciding if you are actually a Christian or a libertarian while we're discussing this.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think purity tests are not fruitful. I think, like you mentioned with Mormons, I think the litmus test for Christianity for me is belief in the Trinity and, and baptism. And, that's just something that, I just don't think that, debates are as fruitful as just finding common ground and, just focusing on loving God and loving others.
Yeah, of course. And I feel like, and maybe you would agree with me on this, especially because you have this background being raised in Protestantism and evangelicalism, that like, I guess I ascribe to what's called more of a branch theory, where like I feel like these are all different parts of like the church, of like the invisible church manifested in sort of different times and places and developing. And I feel like they all, even the ones I disagree with and I don't ascribe to, it's like I'm usually able to find something where I feel like, hey, they get this really right. Like even though I'm not a fundamentalist Baptist, I think that they're pretty good in terms of like they focus a lot on reading scripture and like memorizing verses and things like that. I think Methodists even still today are really good at outreach and really good at like missionary work and doing local work in their communities. The Catholic Church is also like still to this day like one of the top, I think the top actually, in terms of like religious donations and charity and things like that. And from a theological level, I feel like Catholicism also, where I think it has this strength, which I think some people think this is like a weakness from a libertarian perspective, but I think there's something about the Catholic Church as this sort of centralized private institution that I find to be uh, somewhat compelling in terms of just the way that they like they're kind of their own self-governing body in a way that kind of transcends like national law in a way. And uh, I think there's lessons to be learned there. I think there's also theological lessons that Protestants have forgotten. But do you have like the same kind of belief that like even the traditions that you don't ascribe to, like they might have a focus or an area of like praxis or or like Christian activist work that you think like that is something of value that can be learned from?
Oh, sure. I mean, every Christian, faith, every Christian faith has, value in what they practice. Of course, after studying, I'm going to always encourage everyone to come home to Rome. But um, you mentioned the structure of the church. Now, Catholicism is all based in free will, and so comparing the Catholic Church structure to secular government, I still think that, we as libertarians and even anarchists can, with our free will, ascribe to the structure of the Catholic Church for our faith and still, disavow state force in practice as far as, our religious liberties, and as far as, the Catholic Church teaches subsidiarity, which is individual voluntarism and charity over state-forced charity. And so there's a lot of things about the church that are beneficial to people who want to be free from state control and live out their faith without that.
Yeah, it's been a while since I studied crap, I can't even, I always trouble to say that word.
Subsidiarity.
Yeah, subsidiarity. Doesn't that also, isn't part of the teaching of subsidiarity that if something needs to be done by government, that it should be done as local to the problem as is optimal or possible?
Yeah, and it's actually in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, and I have it here. Let me just read that real quick. Widespread participation in voluntary associations and institutions is to be encouraged. In accordance with the principle of subsidiarity, neither the state nor any larger society should substitute itself for the initiative and responsibility of individuals and their intermediary bodies.
Yeah, yeah. So the Lutheran Church in the Magdeburg Confession developed something similar, and from this, and I think also from some Calvin writings, there's a Protestant doctrine of the lesser magistrate, which I think kind of says a lot of the same things, that things should be done, you know, as much as possible done by private institutions and private actors, and whatever role there is for government should be done by the least magistrate possible, right? That's why I call it the lesser magistrate. So it's at least like, it's not explicitly libertarian, but it's like directionally libertarian, right? Like it's kind of,
Right.
Saying that like the normative way in which governance should work in God's order is not like giant bureaucratic centralized nation states like we have today, that it should be very much locally based governance and control, which I think is very much an alignment between the Protestant and the Catholic traditions.
Yeah, and we have some historical examples of anarchist societies that were Catholic, that operated outside of the state. Ireland is one. For 1,000 years plus, they existed with no sovereign, with no standing army, with no police force, with no monopoly from the state on laws. They were a Catholic nation for pretty much all of that time period, and they settled disputes amongst themselves with restitution and reputation. They didn't exact punishment as bureaucratic vengeance. They didn't have a death penalty. And this worked for them. The Catholic Church would offer education and mediation in disputes, but they didn't have a monopoly on that. They allowed individuals to, work things out themselves, keep their property rights, and that went on until the English conquest of the 17th century.
Yeah. I think that there's kind of two ways to go about sort of like talking about libertarianism from a Christian point of view. There's one way, which I think is perfectly valid, and it might even be the easier sell to some people, although I feel like you can make a stronger case than this one. But I think one way is to sort of just grant to someone that, like, yes, there's a role for law, there's a role for government, and all we're talking about, and I would even say, like, all we're talking about, whether you're a minarchist or even if you're an anarchist, is not if there should be governance or law, but just like what are the best ways to do that, right? So you could make it less of a moral like lesson or moral equation, and you can make it more one of practicality, right? Like focusing on the problem of central planning and the problem of bureaucracy and monopoly and all that, and say that, we think as, and like I would say, like as an ANCAP, that I obviously think that to settle disputes between people and to provide for security and to provide for the general welfare and prosperity of people, that, a legal order that is polycentric, meaning not monopolized, is going to be the the least suboptimal of all possible legal orders, right? Because we live in a fallen world, so we're not going to create a legal order that is without any drawback or trade-offs. But it's just kind of like, what's the least suboptimal way for fallen sinners to organize on this side of eternity? So I feel like that's something that should appeal to a lot of Catholics, and I think it's kind of what I was thinking of and what you were saying, which is that it is. I think there are moral, of course, considerations that need to be brought into the conversation, but I do think it's a good way to get people to start being open to libertarianism, is to just sort of posit it as a conversation about sort of like, this is what Larry does, right? Like, with the whole universal healthcare example. He's like, instead of telling people we disagree with the ends they want, be like, hey, we all want the same thing for the most part. I mean, if they're a good person, right? He's like, we want people cared for. We want people to have health care. We don't want people to be homeless. We don't want, people to be invaded and conquered. So it's just like, now it's just a logistic problem. Like, what's the best way to go about accomplishing that?
Yeah, well, one thing, the state threatens punishment for obedience. The church believes that moral law is a natural law, and threat of force, I think, is, not a way to handle that. They even make things that are bad into laws, and things that are good, they make illegal. So, one of my favorite quotes is St. Augustine: an unjust law is no law at all. By the way, I have that on a t-shirt. There's a libertarian Catholic. They have an Amazon store called Libertas Tees, and you can find all kinds of libertarian Catholic gear there. But it's the state forcing people to be obedient to things that we may not find moral. I don't think is the way to go. I don't think it's the way to handle things.
Yeah, no, obviously I agree with that. I feel like there's this myth, though, among like the Christian nationalist and hardcore conservative types, and I guess almost a mirror image from like the liberal Christians, who I struggle to say that are, I mean, I think it's kind of a mixed bag if you go to a liberal church, because a lot of them are basically like they don't even believe in the supernatural. They don't believe in the resurrection. So at that point, I don't think you're Christian. But there are some people who I think do believe in the gospel and just have very liberal interpretations and liberal politics. But getting off my little rambling there, I feel like, yeah, on the right and the left, there is this sort of belief of like, well, yeah, obviously the state can enforce things we don't like, but then obviously, Amity, the answer is that we just have to be in charge of the state, and then we'll only enforce the things that we like. And that's, and it's like, and it's just funny when I hear them say this, because they'll say to us, the libertarians, that, well, you guys are just stuck in theory. You're idealists, you're utopians, and there's no way that your, preferred way of managing society is ever going to come about. What's more realistic is that we'll take power and it'll never be taken from us. Even though, like, the entirety of history in, modern democratic republics, including in our country here in America, is that, like, there's constantly the changing of power, and every expansion of power then gets abused by the other side and then expanded, and then it's just this constant back and forth. So it's like, our ideas are utopian, unrealistic, but not the idea that you can just well, we'll just grab power and make everything perfect.
Yeah, well, this year, after the Libertarian National Convention last year, and after the Trump getting in office, I actually voted for Trump. I got on the bandwagon of, well, he's making all these promises, and let's just get Ross freed. And, he was campaigning on no wars and all this. So after that, I transitioned actually into the Republican Party very briefly through the Republican Liberty Caucus. And my goal was to get as many Thomas Masseys into office as possible. Now, after I attended a few local Republican events and realized that, I was getting a lot of, oh, bless your heart, when I told him I was the chair of the Liberty Caucus in Virginia, I realized that the establishment just doesn't want liberty, whether it's from the right or the left. I thought that the whole MAGA movement was wanting liberty, and those in power, there may be people out there, voters, who do, but those in power don't. And they're the ones that rule the elections and decide what's going to happen. So that actually drove me further into anarchy. And we actually do have some examples here in the United States of it working. The Catholic Church established hospitals and schools long before the government ever instituted public schools. There was actually an example in the 1870s, a nun by the name of Sister Blandina. She was in the Sisters of Charity in Cincinnati, and she went out to the Wild West, and she established schools and hospitals in Colorado and New Mexico. And she did this without any government assistance or funding. She also mediated disputes between outlaws, and she was a confidant of Billy the Kid. So, that was just not too far back in our recent history. And there's actually a really great book about her. It's called At the End of the Santa Fe Trail, where it's excerpts from her diary that chronicles her journeys. And it was a really great book. I really enjoyed it. If anybody's interested in U.S. Catholic history, I highly recommend it. And then even in our modern history, Doris Day, who was an anarchist, she didn't believe in voting, taxation, or war. And she started the Catholic Workers, where, there's still Catholic worker houses today where, they serve the poor, the homeless, the marginalized. And it's a bridge between the wealthy and the poor, because it's all based on volunteers and donations, where, they keep the government completely out of what they're doing. So I don't think it's a stretch to say that we can have parallel societies outside of the government to accomplish great things. in our communities and, even further in the country.
Yeah, no, Dorothy Day is a great example of a Catholic anarchist. I was trying to find
I
it when
think
you
I
brought
said
it up. I
Doris
know.
Day. Yeah, Dorothy Day.
Yeah, no, it's fine. She has. There's this one quote. I'm trying to find of her. If I find it later, I might. She has a really great quote about anarchy, but I can't find it just by searching for it. I'll find it later and share it. But she yeah, no, she's definitely I mean, she was a little bit. I think some people try to say she was more of a left anarchist, but I think she was just more of like I don't even think back then. I don't know if she overlapped with Rothbard or not, where she could have even considered anarcho-capitalism. I do think that this is something to ask you as a Catholic, that there's often this sort of from some Catholics, I've heard Trent Horn talk about this. I've heard the last Pope talk about this. I don't know if I've heard the current Pope talk about this, but they kind of do this thing where I think I don't even know if it's that they've thought about it this deeply. I think they're just sort of mixing in just sort of some comment, what they think is the common sense from just the culture we're raised in, is they'll talk about how well, capitalism is good, but if capitalism goes too far and is unrestrained, then it leads to the abuse of workers and people being impoverished, and and charity won't be enough, or something like that. So yeah, I think that sometimes there is this thought, and this will actually, I think, it'd be a good segue to something I know you wanted to talk about, because there's this Catholic principle of the consistent ethic of life. And in my research of this is one of those things that was more formalized, I guess, in the the 1960s, but it has roots in Augustine and Aquinas, in terms of they were basically talking about what this principle is, even though they didn't give it that explicit name at that time. But if you want to go ahead and talk about the consistent ethic of life, and how the Catholic Church, and how you would define that, and then we can kind of get into unpacking that a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. So if anybody heard my presidential nomination speech at the Libertarian Convention last year, one of my lines was that the non-aggression principle extends from the womb to the tomb. And of course, as you know, there's nothing new under the sun, as it says in Ecclesiastes. And so I wasn't shocked when Free actually introduced me to writings of Joseph Cardinal Bernardin. He was the Archbishop of Chicago before he passed, rest in peace. And he actually had a quote I want to read. The protection, defense, and nurture of human life involve the whole spectrum of life, from conception to death, cutting across issues as genetics, abortion, capital punishment, modern warfare, and the care of the terminally ill. Now, in reading his writings, of course, he was not libertarian. He encouraged the state to enforce these things and to provide funding for these things. But my belief is that the more the state gets out of these things, the better. So I kind of look at that, the consistent ethic of life, that concept, from a libertarian perspective.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I feel like there's Bernardine. There was someone who came after him, and there was some critics from within the Catholic Church who were not disagreeing with the principle, but kind of saying that it had to be clarified or limited somewhat. Looks like it was people like George Weigel. I don't know how to pronounce his last name, but they were basically saying that there needed to be a delineation between considerations of the ethical action based upon a premeditated individual act, like just murdering someone, for example, versus decisions that are made by people in positions of authority that are made for prudential reasons or calculations that might have downstream effects of hurt of like leading to people getting hurt, and that he was like worried about there being a sort of moral equivalency. And this was where I had to, like, as a Protestant, try to like put my Catholic hat on and be like, well, that doesn't seem to follow to me. I could argue against that as a Protestant, but I wanted to kind of put it in Catholic terms why I didn't think that made sense, because I think in Catholic theology, I think that you guys have a distinction. You can correct me if you think I'm getting it wrong, but I think that there's a distinction between physical evil, right, or like evils of tragedy or evils of nature, which is like suffering or harm or loss that happens just because of like normal everyday human activity that isn't directly harming someone else. So it could be like accidental injuries, or just like people getting sick, or like people, like if someone gets fired from a job, that might be like hurting them, might be causing them harm. If someone is like homeless, or if someone is going through something tough, but it doesn't mean that like someone is actively sinning against them, compared to like moral evil, which is like people are like intentionally premeditating to commit like sin, whether that's sin against God or sin against someone else. But I feel like that, like, then with those categories, that like what some people try to do is to suggest that, well, when governments do things, it's just like kind of like part of the natural order, and like there's no intentionality or moral culpability behind it. And I just don't think that follows. I think that there's certainly a biblically defined role for like people in authority, but they're still people, right? And they're like, if you're acting and your action, like, if I'm the president and I order a bomb to be dropped on a village of innocent people, I can't just say, well, I don't have any moral culpability, because when I did that, I was acting in the role of president and making a prudential calculation about, like, I needed to kill these innocent people to a chain. I'm like I don't think that there's a separate Catholic or even Protestant, obviously, category that would say that people in positions of authority are exempt from the moral culpability of their actions. I think that might be what they try to tell themselves, right? That might be the propaganda they try to tell us to justify their actions. But I don't think that actually follows logically.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not up on all of Catholic theology when it comes to moral culpability, except for the fact that we are all humans. And, government is made up of humans. Government is the largest institutional killer in human history when it comes to war. Just in the 20th century alone, I believe it's 262 million civilians have been killed by governments around the world. Just since 9/11, the U.S. has spent $10 trillion and has killed millions of civilians in wars in the Middle East and around the country in the pursuit of freedom. So it's definitely something that I think our government should be encouraged to pursue diplomacy and peace, especially with the threat of nuclear war, where human eradication could happen on an unimaginable scale. So, I think as libertarians who are activists, we should be encouraging those that are elected in office to pursue peace.
Right. And like a passage like Romans 12, which says to live at peace with everyone insofar as it depends on you. Like, that's not just for private citizens, right? Turning the other cheek isn't just for private citizens. Loving your enemies isn't just for private citizens. Like, I feel like this is more of a Protestant thing. I don't know if there is a Catholic equivalent, but I know within Protestantism, one sort of doctrine that developed was a what's called like a two kingdoms uh, theology, and it's sort of like, well, God rules the earth through, like, Christ is king and he's kind of reigning from heaven, but then also God sort of um, runs the world through sort of like uh, governments and human institutions, and he's like providentially in charge of those, but that they don't quite operate through the same lens. And I think it's kind of like, well, that's partially true insofar as I think that God's judgment is for all sin, and I don't think that human institutions are meant to judge sin in the same way, right? Like the ultimate wages of sin is death. So if I die and I haven't been saved, then I might, pay those wages. But like, it's not the job of Christians to go around and like exact divine judgment on people for, committing adultery or being bad parents or lying or etc. Right? But I feel like then people can take that kind of two kingdom view too far, and they'll just be like, yeah, again, like creating these like moral exceptions for people in power as if they're not held by the same moral standards. Whereas I feel like if you're going to claim to be holding authority and power to do things that I can't do, you should be held to a higher standard, not a lower, or different one. That's just my sense of it. But yeah, I think as far as this consistent, sorry, I keep forgetting the name of it. I have to go up my notes. The consistent ethic of life, that it's like you want to provide for people who are, the widow, the poor, the downtrodden. It's like, okay, but what is state welfare? It's using legal violence to you're using basically at the threat of force, like you're basically pointing a gun at someone and saying, give me your money, but I'm morally justified in doing that because I'm going to give it to a poor person. It's like, well, that wouldn't work if you and I did that, right? Like if you and I, like, imagine going to your priest and being like, oh, I just gave like, $10,000 to charity today. Like, oh, where'd you find that money? It's like, oh, I went and robbed a bunch of people.
Right, exactly. And, take abortion, for example. I'd like to see a tax policy where the state does not take the money that we earn so that compassionate individuals can have significantly more of what they earn to give to things that they believe in. For example, I support crisis pregnancy centers. There's several that, I've donated to and that I've helped out. One is called Let Them Live, letthemlive.org. That's a secular organization, but they help women who are looking for alternatives to abortion and don't think that they have the means to do so. A Catholic organization is called Mary's Choice, and they have chapters all over the country. My local one is maryschoicerva.org, and they do the same thing. And, they have a semblance of faith wrapped into, what they do, but they help people. And so, I know that there's a debate in libertarian circles about whether the state should use force to ban abortion because it's murder, in my view, because all life is precious from conception. And, my thought is, if we have more voluntary, compassionate organizations where we can support and encourage women to find alternatives, then there would be less abortion. I don't think that the state is the right avenue to, force morals or, force our views on other people. If you would have asked me a year ago if I think the state should ban abortion, I would have said emphatically yes. Now I'm kind of on the fence because I feel like the state gets so much wrong. And, to what end? Do we make abortion illegal and then put women in jail who, might have miscarried and,
Right.
Then somebody claims, oh, you had an abortion. It's not something we can really enforce through force or or punishment. So, my whole thing is get the state out of it and just allow people to voluntarily find options.
Yeah, I feel like there's like two questions with almost any topic, and we can apply it to abortion, which is like just the sort of moral calculation, the theological and philosophical, and even like legal, just to be like, like, is it aggression to kill an unborn child? And I think on Christian grounds and even libertarian grounds, I think yes.
Yeah.
Then you have to consider like, okay, now what is enforcement of like if this aggression has occurred, like what is the response to that? And I think there are all sorts of mechanisms in an anarchist legal order to deal with abortion that would, you would de-license people through private licensing networks. Insurances companies would be afraid of the legal liability of like paying for abortions because they just wouldn't have blanket immunity from the state and from state courts. So they would have, if they allowed any abortions, they would have like the strictest rules and whatnot, and higher rates for people that wanted to have that kind of coverage. So it'd be heavily disincentivized. And again, there'd be no legal shielding. So anyone who thought that like aggression that occurred could bring a legal tort against a doctor or, someone who they think, committed that aggression. And then it gets into then like, well, then how do you respond to that for the people who actually, metaphorically pulled the trigger? But before you even answer that, you need to even think about just like, how should we handle murder in the first place? And I feel like we often, because of like normalcy bias, we will think that the right way to handle a problem is kind of like similar to how we handle it now. And so we think the best way to handle murder is to either use the death penalty where that still exists, or to lock someone up for like the rest of their life. And I certainly think if someone is a ongoing danger to society, like if they're mentally unstable or psychotic or something, then like there's considerations to be made there on how to like make sure they don't hurt anyone. But I think that justice has a element of restitution, but there needs to be an element of like restorative justice that needs to be added to the conversation, including with abortion, because I think in the case of abortion, I think you would agree with me, there's more than one victim, because I think that the baby is the obvious first victim, but I think the mother is a victim too in the case of an abortion. And it creates these moral and psychological quandaries that then, I'm not saying that law doesn't intersect with the calculation, but law is insufficient on its own to tackle that problem. We need the church. We need, professionals like psychologists, and ultimately, like, yeah, like restoration and healing needs to be part of the equation too. And then to connect it to what you said, like, then like all of this, being said, if you ask me point blank, well, should Washington, D.C., the federal government, ban abortion in all 50 states? It's like, if the goal is to lower abortions, if the goal is to protect mothers and unborn children and liberty, I don't know that accomplishes that. So I'm not saying I'm like 100% against it, but I'm definitely not convinced it's the best path forward.
Sure. And, I would also add to your victim list that fathers are also victims, because sometimes abortions happen when the fathers, want their children. And so, that might factor into the restoration or the restitution question. But, most women who have abortions feel like that they have no other alternative. And so I just think it behooves us as a society to offer alternatives, make adoption easier.
Yep.
State, they just make things way too difficult. My niece actually was fostering a baby for a couple of years, and it took several years, just to move from foster to adoption because of the horrible CPS system that we live under. So, there's ways to get the state out of, the business of trying to be in everyone's business that would just make society better for everyone involved.
Yeah. I mean, there's also just this is like, it's still an argument. It's not like a philosophical argument, but there is something kind of rich of like anytime, especially right now, conservatives and Trump supporters come to me and try to make arguments that are based in think of the children while we don't have the Epstein files. And it seems pretty strongly that a lot of the current administration is either complicit in like they were in the Epstein files or they're actively covering it up. So it's kind of like, it's like, again, talking about like prudential considerations and enforcement, I think there's obviously a role for law, but if your enforcement of law in pursuit of, well, we have to protect people from violence, but then it's like, I want to protect people from violence, and therefore I've advocated for this system which increases the level of violence and creates more victims than there otherwise would have been. Well, then it's like you probably need to go back and consider that there's a better way to accomplish your goal than than accomplishing this through the state. But I guess I feel like again, I kind of said this earlier, people say libertarianism and anarchism is a utopian philosophy, but I think it's actually it's like projection almost subconsciously, because I feel like what the anarchist and libertarian is saying is like, we live in a fallen, imperfect world, and we can't just like come up with perfect solutions for every problem. And the best way to try to solve problems is through a decentralized market-based approach where you have, kind of the entirety of human innovation to bear on the problem, and you're minimizing the sort of problem of trying to use a blunt instrument of force and centralized power to solve it, which that seems to create more problems. So I call it like the nirvana the nirvana fallacy, where like the statist is telling me, well, unless your system, like they're dissatisfied with liberty because it doesn't in their mind perfectly prevent every bad thing from happening. But but that's not even that's a fallacy, because it's not on the table. We know the state doesn't prevent every bad possible thing from happening. And in fact, like, I always want to be careful to not like literally be the meme of just like blaming everything on the government. But it's actually really hard to find like instances of human evil and injustice that government law doesn't at least influence to some degree.
Yeah, well, take capital punishment, for example. So, the state imposes the death penalty, and Florida, for example, in the last 50 years, 20% of people on death row were later exonerated because it was found that they were innocent. Now, think about the 80% who actually were executed. It makes me wonder, how many of them were actually innocent and the state got it wrong. So I feel like, if we want to be consistent with protecting human life from the state, especially, we should probably reconsider the death penalty as well, because, every human life is precious, and we do have ways to, keep society safe from dangerous individuals without taking potentially an innocent human life.
Yeah. So the death penalty is such a complicated topic for me. So I know it's official, and I always get this I don't know if it's dogma, but I think it's doctrine at least, that the Catholic teaching is that the death penalty is immoral. I don't think that's been. I think it's a development. I feel like that's. Oh, I know it wasn't always a doctrine. I think Catholics have some debate over whether it was like always believed but just not explicitly written, or if it was inconsistent and developed over time. But that's. I'm a Protestant, not a Catholic, so some of that's like, insider baseball for Catholics, and I've like read different things on that, and so it's like I don't exactly know what the truth on that is. But as a Protestant, just based going on what Scripture teaches and what my own tradition teaches, I'm not against the death penalty in principle, because I think it is a extension of self-defense, and I'm not a pacifist. So I think that, you can use lethal force to protect yourself from an attacker, and if the aggression was so high that then it's like, well, uh, there's no possible restitution they can do, and the options are like, put them in some facility that someone has to pay for them to be cared for, and you have to worry about them breaking out and hurting someone else, or you use the death penalty as a punishment. And the Bible, just from a strict reading of it, Old and New Testament, there's no provision that seems to clearly condemn it. So it's like, I'm not against it in principle. In practice, however, giving that to the state, for all the reasons you said, is a horrible idea, right? Because we know that that there's so many cases of people who were on death's row, and like I think they intentionally make death's row last a long time for a lot of people, because then they'll find evidence and like overturn the conviction and be like, oh nope, we got the wrong guy. So our criminal justice system is so screwed up that it just leaves no room for me to actually ever want to cede that kind of power to the state, to give them the power over who to kill, even though I'm not against it in in just kind of like the abstract. Although I feel like it should be a preference, like, because I don't think, like, this is one of those things where I think there's one of the differences I've noticed in Catholic and Protestant philosophy is that Catholics will frame certain things as evil, even though they can be kind of permissible. Like, I think the Catholic view is sort of like that killing, even if it's defensive, is still like evil, in terms of like it's like a tragedy, right? And I think Protestants would say something similar but differently, that like it's not sinful, but it's a result of the fall, right? It's a result of living in the fallen world, and that even killing someone in defense is like falling short of the perfection of Christ. Like, we should never, like, what's one of the things I struggle with libertarian circles, I don't know if you've ever got this, where like I'm of course really pro Second Amendment, really pro gun ownership and self-defense, but I don't like when I get some of the people in those circles who are literally like like almost seemingly like they want to joke about and relish the opportunity to kill people in self-defense. And it's like, well, maybe you can do that on libertarian grounds, but I don't think as a Christian that really jives. And even though like I am a responsible gun owner, and have taken classes and think about how to defend myself, I've also thought about like, how can I use the firearm in a way that like prevents me from having to pull the trigger, because I don't want to kill someone, even someone who's attacking my family, because I know like it doesn't matter how justified it is, that's killing a person who was made in the image of God, and also that's going to be traumatic for me and the people around me.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely not a pacifist. I don't think the church teaches pacifism. I could be wrong, but they have the just war theory, which
Yeah.
I mean, that calls for war in the extreme circumstance where you're defending yourself, and I think that translates to the individual as well. I'm a proponent of the Second Amendment. I own firearms. I carry everywhere, and if it comes down to a stranger who's holding a gun to my face or me, I'm going to live and I'm going to protect my family and those loved ones around me. So, I don't think it's a moral evil to take someone's life. As a matter of fact, I think it would be a moral evil for me to allow someone to kill me and leave my loved ones without my support. You're muted.
Yep. I think it's one of those things that it's like, the way I would put it is that I would never say it's good to kill someone in self-defense, but in that instance, when someone has initiated force, it's like there a conflict has been introduced between loving your neighbor and loving your enemy. And when that conflict happens, it's like, okay, like there is, and I think this is a Catholic teaching. I know I forget the technical Latin term. It's like ordo amoris or something like that. I know JD Vance talked about it, but it's like ordered loves, and how like I obviously care about the people that our government is bombing halfway across the world, but my love for my family and my duty to them, like, obviously there's a higher love and obligation to them than there is to a stranger halfway across the world, even if they're like a brother or sister in Christ who I might care about. But it would be wrong for me to be like, oh, there's someone suffering, across the world, I'm going to abandon my family to go help them. Like, no, that's not what that's not what follows. And similarly, like, yeah, like I'm called to love my enemy, and it's not good if I have to use lethal force on them. But if they've introduced a conflict where it's like me or my family or them, well, then you could say it's the right thing to do, or you could say like it's the least wrong thing to do. Because I feel like we live in a fallen world, and sometimes we're presented with situations where there's not like a perfect, like sinless. Well, it might be like it's not that you're sinning, but like the conflict is a result of sin, right? Right. So like you're responding to the sin of someone else, and you want to love them, but there's no way. Sometimes we can wish for it, right? Like divine intervention, where like, the gun misfires and they stop attacking you. But short of that, then you have to, act on your own will. Yeah, just war theory is again, that's something that Augustine started and Aquinas developed as well, and super like not talked about enough in Christian and political discourse right now. A lot of people think just war theory amounts to just like, so here's the parameters for when you're allowed to go to war, and then once you've declared war, then just do whatever you can to win the war. And it's like, that's not what Augustine or Aquinas said, because they had all sorts of category. I mean, like Augustine developed like the structure, and then Aquinas, because that's what Aquinas does, like really systematized it and added a lot of language to it. I did a whole write-up on this for LCI and a podcast as well. But there's justice in going to war. Like, are you justified in going to war? And then there's justice in war, like conducting the war. And then there's justice after the war in terms of resolving it and like bringing the conflict to a proper conclusion. And when you read the theory in its entirety and you try to apply that to any war in recent history, people will read my article or other people who are bringing this up and be like, so like, what are you saying, that like no war is just? And it's like, maybe. I mean, the burden of proof isn't on me to like go back and apologize for the wars that we've committed. If they don't meet the standard, they don't meet the standard. Even the Revolutionary War is not, it's not as bad as other ones, but it's not without its there's like, libertarians like Brian Kaplan who bring up at least interesting arguments, I think, to consider, like, was it really like the last, because like one of the things is like it has to be the last resort, and it's like that can be kind of hard to judge, right? Like, who gets to say what the last resort is? But But anyway, yeah, I think just war theory that's one of those Catholic doctrines that needs to have a renaissance, I think.
Yeah, it's definitely not talked about enough. But, I think war is justified if you're defending life, liberty, and property. And like you said, when you go to war, you bear responsibility for innocent human life as well. And, you have to think about that, not just in, when it comes to casualties, but also afterwards. If, for example, Gaza, it's a genocide, and the entire, region has been left a parking lot, and now there's no infrastructure. And now there's people displaced, and there's people who have been left without limbs, and there's been tens of thousands of people killed, including women and children. So, you have to ask yourself, when our state goes to war or funds a war, is it because we're defending ourselves, or is there some other reason?
Yeah, of course. I feel like the test I often do for a lot of these things is just to like ask yourself, like, if Jesus was standing right next to you, what would you say to justify your action, right? Like, you understand, Jesus, I've really got to drop this bomb on this hospital filled with Palestinian, women and children. Like, I have absolutely no other choice. It has to be done. It's just like,
Right.
I mean, I'm kind of laughing because it's just like, it's ludicrous. Like, and I have to somewhat believe that there's so many people who just aren't thinking critically about it, because I have a hard time believing, because I think it'd be really depressing to think there's a lot of professing Christians who legitimately think that they could stand before Jesus and just be like, yep, absolutely, Jesus, I had to do that, and not waver at all in that in that decision or judgment. So
Yeah, I get pushback all the time on social media from mostly Christians whose theology is dispensationalist or Zionist, that think that, we're defending some sort of, religious institution put in place by God in a secular government on the other side of the globe. And so, I feel like a lot of Christians don't even think about the human cost of war. They're so conditioned to think that, evil people include their offspring. And, I don't get it. I just think,
yeah.
Every human life is a precious gift of God. And the more lives we take, the more we're going to have to answer for that.
Yeah. And obviously, and we've talked about this, not on this stream, but on others, the immigration topic is obviously, mixed up in this consideration of human life and the treatment of people as well. I know you've advocated for like ethical deportation or immigration control or something to that effect, which I've heard you like briefly explain, but I do want to dive a little bit more into that, because I feel like immigration is the one issue that gives me, I think, the most sort of hang up, because I feel like we're presented with a sort of unfixable problem, because unlike some open borders libertarians, I understand that there are real consequences to unrestricted migration. And to be clear, I don't think what we've gone through over the last 10 years is just the result of unrestricted immigration. I think it's also the result of intentional importing of people from different parts of the world. I don't think anyone in good faith can deny that that's a big part of what's going on. And obviously there's a lot of other externalities like the war on drugs and things like that. So like any open borders advocate has to at least bite that bullet that the people coming into America right now, it's not just like this libertarian vision of just like everyone's just coming here to get a job and settle down, and it's just free market incentives and reactions from top to bottom. Like there's definitely consequences economically, there's consequences culturally. There's consequences for our physical safety. You know, I know my wife has gotten concerned at seeing more, you know, Muslim immigrants and just people who don't speak the language. It lowers social trust. It puts people in awkward situations because they don't know who their neighbors is. They don't know that they share the same values. You know, there's countries around the world that are canceling New Year's Eve celebrations, like in France and other places, because of all the Muslim immigration that they've gotten in Europe. They have increased instances of terrorist attacks, and they're on high alert now, and it makes public gatherings a lot harder. So now, but on the other hand, it's like, okay, but like, what's the solution? Give government the control over immigration and then do a bunch of deportation? Like that's a hard bridge for me to cross because I just see so many problems with that. I know you don't support the current deportation you know, apparatus and whatnot in the Trump administration, which you did say you voted for Trump and now kind of, you know, regret it. And I'm also in that camp and voted for him for pretty much the same reasons you did. Was optimistic maybe something good could happen other than Ross being freed. I guess the only other positive is that the clown show is now even more on display. But go on and give me your thoughts on that and on, you know, the idea of what like ethical deportation looks like if that's possible.
Well, I see the immigration and the deportation as two different issues. So just real quickly with immigration, I mean, I know we don't live in a utopia. So while I'm kind of like the Ellis Island style immigration proponent, all countries have borders. So, you know, if we wake up tomorrow in utopia and we don't have borders, it's just not going to happen. So for me, I feel like, you know, as long as people come here with the means to support themselves or a sponsor, a, you know, employer or whatever, no communicable diseases and no criminal history in their home country, then I say, come here, get a job. That's not going to happen with our current system because we have the welfare state where people enter in and then the federal government is providing them with thousands of dollars a month, housing, food. I guess Trump has, you know, cut some of that off, but we cannot have mass immigration into our country with the current welfare state. I think everyone should support themselves, stand on their own 2 feet, just as I do. And, you know, so nobody should be coming here for a handout. I think that will greatly reduce the amount of immigrants if we don't have, you know, checks welcoming them at the border. So that's one thing. But as far as deportation, you know, you hear the deport them all. And I get a lot of pushback on this issue, probably one of the most pushback I get on social media, because again, these are human lives we're dealing with. Some of these people have been here for decades. There are even instances I've heard of where people who are here legally go to their, you know, every whatever time frame, you know, they have to go show up to the immigration office to check in, and their green cards are being removed and then they're being deported. These are not criminals that are being deported back to their countries. These are hardworking people, whether undocumented or not. And some came over as children, and they're being deported to countries that they have no ties to. Now, we've also seen, I believe last count that I read was 70 people have died as a result of these mass deportation policies. And a few of those were actually United States citizens who were caught up in the mass deportations. Now, we have places like Alcatraz Island where Catholic immigrants who are being detained are not receiving the sacraments. And that's a basic human right. In the view of, you know, the Catholic Church, it's religious freedom. We're free here, and it's not just for American citizens. The Constitution also protects any humans that are on our shores, with exception of a few things. And they're not receiving the sacraments, and they're not receiving proper care. And it's so sad to see, my fellow conservative Christian brothers and sisters who just say, oh, I don't care. They shouldn't have been here in the first place. Well, they're still human beings. They are here, and we need to treat them with dignity.
Yeah, I don't know if you watched. I got into some heated exchanges with Jack on the last "Are You Smarter Than a Politician" stream, and the I just was like, I don't understand. Like, conservatives want to, like, on one hand, like, echo the Constitution and Declaration of Independence and American idea of, like, our rights are bestowed upon us by the Creator, they're inalienable. But then as soon as we talk about immigration, they become legal positivists, and they're just like, well, they came here legally, so they don't have rights, so they don't get due process. And I'm just like, it's like, I don't understand how they don't see the big giant contradiction there, even if, like, on top of the logical problem of, like, even if I grant to you that people who came here illegally should be deported, how do you know which people came here illegally without due process?
Exactly. And, I'm all for non-citizens who are violent offenders being deported back to their home countries. I don't have a problem with that. I want law and order in our society. I want to live in a peaceful society. But, rounding up grandma or rounding up, a mom sitting in the line to pick up her kid from school right in front of her, or right in front of her kids, is just so inhumane. And, it's just not the way that we should be operating.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. I guess I just feel like, I don't know where you sit on this. I don't disagree with much of the problem you're laying out with immigration. I just don't know that. To me, it seems like it would be easier and with less of a trade-off to liberty to just focus on freeing the markets and ending welfare than it would be to try to find what to me feels like a little bit of a, like, and I don't want to say this in a way that, like, comes across as, like, flippant or dismissive, but to me, what you're trying to get at, which is a immigration policy that is humane coming from the state, is like asking for a bit of a unicorn. Because I see what the state does with every other thing. We were talking about abortion, right? And it's just like, like, if I can't trust the state with abortion, I definitely don't think I can trust them with immigration. So I feel like, I think I'm as fair about this topic as, like, anyone in the movement is, because, like, I don't go around doing the purity testing and telling the libertarians who advocate against, I don't like using the term open borders. I just like to say I'm for free migration or free movement. I think it's more accurate. But the people who are, like, who advocate for, whether they're anarchists or minarchists, advocating for some border restrictions, like, I think they're still libertarians. So I don't want to gatekeep or divide over this issue. As long as they're like you, to be clear, like, if there's people who are like, I'm a libertarian, but also, like, go ICE and deport them all, and, yay, no, then I'm like, okay, that's a little bit different. But I don't know, like, what do you think? Like, I guess I'm just inclined to think it's easier to just, like, it's hard either way, but I feel like it'd be easier to just, like, focus on the welfare and freeing the markets and increasing opportunity, and then, like, just focus on the violent. If people come here and they're violent, sure, deport them, right? But other than that, I don't. I think we're gonna have an easier time, as it was the expression, like, build the walls around welfare, right? Than trying to keep people out, or only deporting the people that deserve to be deported.
Yeah, I mean, if you end the welfare state, you completely fix the immigration problem. I believe that 100%. Nobody is going to come here who can't support themselves, if there's no welfare state in place. So, I think that is basically the end all be all to our immigration problems. And the state needs to not make it so difficult for good people who want to come here for the American dream to gain citizenship.
Oh yeah, no, 100%. I feel like part of the issue is that we create this black market effect, right? Because we
Right.
make it so hard to come here legally, and then just like anything that you kind of prohibit or ban, then it's like the people who would probably be the best candidates to come here and integrate are getting deported or kept out, whereas the people who are, and again, I don't want to like, some people are coming here illegally because they're desperate or whatnot. So it's not like I'm trying to disparage all of them, but in terms of the pool, you're getting a more mixed pool with more quote unquote undesirables when you make legal immigration that much harder. So yeah, I feel like that's, a big part of the problem as well. I also just think from a basic like Austrian free market libertarian perspective that like my issue is that MAGA tends to also be, they're not just worried about immigration. They tend to be full isolationist and anti-free trade and pro-tariffs. And I'm just like, well, and what I used to say to them before Trump got elected was, you guys are saying you're anti-war. Well, the old saying goes where people and goods, on borders where people and goods don't freely travel across, tanks and armies will. That argument probably doesn't work as well with MAGA now that they are, probably pro war now that Trump has renamed the Department of War and all that.
Right.
But I think the argument still holds some water. Like I did want to ask you, because I guess it's maybe somewhat of the elephant in the room that maybe some people want me to ask you, but I don't want it to be like a debate or anything like that, but just more of a curiosity. Because like some people, of course, there's people in the comments who are just like telling me that like it's time, Jacob, come back to Rome, and it's like listen, I've explored it. I'm not convinced by the arguments that when Jesus said, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church," I just don't see the biblical basis for the papacy as it exists today. And there's other issues I have, but that's kind of like my biggest thing for why I'm not a Catholic. But I'm curious, like, what is, if you could like crystallize it into like one thing, uh, you know, if you're reluctant to call yourself an anarchist, what is your like hesitancy? Like, is it a, is there like one issue or one argument where you're just like, yeah, I don't know that anarchy could work, or is it, because I know sometimes I've talked to some minarchists who basically say that they're anarchists at heart, and their concern is more like, I don't know that we're ever going to get to anarchy, and so I'm going to be a minarchist in the here and now. And I basically say, well, then you're just basically an anarchist, and you're just very pessimistic. But anyway, I was kind of curious to talk to you a little bit about that here at the end, just kind of like, I know you've been, I know Free and other people have been pushing you on that. And I'm just curious where you're at on it.
Yeah, I would say that I'm not pessimistic, but I'm a realist. And so I am focusing on trying to use political activism to dismantle the systems that we have. I don't think that we're going to have anarchy in our lifetime. However, as individuals, we can create as many parallel systems, away from government, to opt out of the system as we can. So I think that's probably why I haven't gone full-blown anarchy. I mean, I have no faith in the federal government. I think local communities, there's some, there's some benefit there for infrastructure and what have you. I still vote because if there's measures that I think will reduce the size of government, of course, I'm going to vote on those. But, I used to think from a minarchist perspective that we still needed parameters around national defense and securing our borders and, having the structure of government in DC. But I've lost so much faith, especially in the last year, and seeing, how ineffective our federal government is, and the lack of accountability and the fraud that has been uncovered, and then nothing has been done about it. It's just a system too far gone. So while I would consider myself, an anarchist at heart, I'm a realist, and I'll still participate in the system enough to reduce it as much as possible.
Do you think that, I think you kind of even said, Ireland was sort of this way. Do you think anarchy is possible in a society where people are basically either Christian or operating in a Christian ethos and, are sort of the mindset of, they are, even if they don't call themselves anarchist, they are of the mindset of, being inclined towards self-government. There's that kind of culture of personal responsibility and kind of mutual aid to solve problems rather than looking for handouts. Do you think that kind of society is practical?
Yeah, absolutely. Look at the Amish. I mean, we have societies right here in the United States where they opt out of the government and participate through mutual aid. They don't have traditional health insurance. They don't, they build their own roads and, things like that. And they don't need Social Security. They don't need Medicare. And they operate just fine. They run their own schools. And so, yeah, I think it's completely plausible that we can create communities and societies outside of the governmental system and succeed.
I mean, if I said that anarchism was also not just a can we have a stateless society, but just a sort of a moral or legal philosophy when it pertains to just just the non-aggression principle and just the use of force, would you have any would you say you're philosophically you said anarchist at heart, I guess would that be the same as saying you're basically philosophically an anarchist? Or because I think there's no difference between anarchism and voluntarism, for example. So I think if you want a society that this is where I think some minarchists who say I want a state that's funded voluntarily and that everyone has to consent to, I'm just you're I see my friend Hody's in the chat, and Hody used to be like this. He had a debate with Larkin Rose about anarchy, and it was 40 minutes of Larkin interrogating Hody until he basically said, Hody, you're an anarchist. You just it's entirely semantics, but everything you're describing to me is anarchy. So but I guess I'm just wondering if that's kind of where you're at, where it's more of a because I think I'm an anarchist, but I tend to be like you, I'm a realist. I'm listen, especially because I'm a Christian, I'm we live in a fallen world. We might never have widespread, anarcho-capitalism, ever in this lifetime. Maybe just I think it's possible, as we've seen before, for short stints of some parts of society to get close to it for periods of time. But for me, it's just more of a North Star of just what do I think is right and wrong? And I just think that it's always wrong to initiate force against my neighbor. And if we could get society to organize anarchistically, I think that's the right way to do it. So, I mean, is there anything there that you would, disagree with, or do you think that's basically where you're at?
No, that's pretty much exactly where I'm at. I mean, I'm just realistic at, the society that we live in. And, we have to continue to live within those parameters, with our neighbors who might not think like us, or, might love the government enough to, want them to control everything. And, I think my focus is being vocal about messages of liberty to, bring more awareness to people who may not have thought of these things before.
Yeah, no, 100%. I feel like, I mean, obviously, like we're all going to play different roles in, just like within the church, there's the body of Christ, and there's that metaphor about the division of labor within the church, and I think that applies to being advocates not just for the gospel, but for liberty. Is like we're all going to take different niches. I kind of take the niche of like, I'm a I guess I'm like the street preacher anarchist, where I'm just like, it's in my name. I just kind of force the conversation because my mindset is that I think a lot of people think anarchy means chaos and lawlessness. And I just want to get people to be like, what? You're an anarchist? Doesn't that mean this? And then I get the opportunity to say, well, no, anarchy is just a relationship and just means that I own me and you own you in a legal sense. I mean, God owns all of us, but I don't own you and you don't own me. So I don't have a right to, compel you by force to do anything, other than just to not, the only obligation we have towards each other is that we don't use force against each other. And to me, that's anarchy. And I want to force that conversation with people. That's why I kind of like the way Michael Malice talks about it. But yeah, I mean, if it means anything to you or to the audience, I will give you the the biblical anarchy stamp of approval to say you're an anarchist. But there are some like purist anarchists out there. Like I saw Impure Hunter in the chat asking about if anarchists can participate in the system or politics, and that's a debate within anarchist circles. And yeah, there are some anarchists who I think are not realists, who think that
that voting is violence.
Voting is violence, and that any participation in the system legitimizes it. And I respect those types. I don't want to make them my enemy, but yeah, I think if you believe in anarchy, if you believe in the non-aggression principle, if you believe in voluntary relationships, then I think that means you're philosophically an anarchist. Praxeologically, like, what do we do while we live in an unfree world? Like, I think we need to be humble about that, and kind of like, we're all going to try different things to move the needle in the right direction. And I think we all do that, right? Like, I think Larkin Rose in his own way moves the needle. I think, I hope what we do here at LCI moves the needle. And I think what, I know what you've done, your advocacy, there's plenty of people who you've influenced in the right direction. And, I think that's kind of the right way to look at it. But I want to give you the last word here, Amity, before we close out, just on your thoughts on that, and anything else you want to close on in terms of just like the, or if you want to, you can also flip the script on me. I gave you my my reason why I'm not a Catholic. If you want to give your your retort to my why I'm not convinced about the papacy, I don't want to like let I want to be charitable and let you give some kind of comment on that if you want to.
Yeah, actually, I would like to comment on that. For 20 years, as a Protestant, I heavily debated people of other faiths, other denominations, even Catholics. I was very anti-Catholic before I wasn't. And, in the infancy of message boards in the early 2000s, I joined a lot of spaces where I was heavily into debate of theology. Now, I have decided that I don't debate theology anymore. You are very well read. You're, I would say probably more of a scholar than I am in a lot of theology. And so it's not up to me to convince you about the papacy or any other theology. I just don't debate anymore. I've found my way, and my way has led me to the Catholic Church. And I just encourage everyone else out there to let the Holy Spirit guide them and come to the truth that Jesus Christ is King. And, if that leads you to Rome, then that's amazing. And if it doesn't, then, there's nothing that I can say in a debate that would change your mind. So I just choose to be charitable and prayerful and love my neighbor and just, go from there in that light.
Yeah, no, I think that's kind of where, like, I think it's fun. I don't do it on podcasts. I think it's fun to just, like, with friends sometimes, like, not like debate, but just kind of like get into theological discussions and explore the disagreements. But then even then, I think it's a combination of like finding where you disagree, but also finding the areas of agreement. Like I saw someone in the chat bring it up earlier that about, supersessionism, which is just the belief that, the church is Israel. And I'm like, yeah, that's a Reformed belief. That's a Catholic belief. That's an Eastern Orthodox belief. I'm like, it's really just a historic Christian belief up until dispensationalism 100 years ago
Right.
was founded. But like, I think what we said at the beginning, like, we believe in the Trinity. We affirm the Apostles' Creed. We affirm the Nicene Creed. Like, what holds us in common, I think, is of much more significance than what we disagree on. And similarly, I have a lot of friends who are coming to faith not through Protestant churches, but I see them either coming to Catholicism or to Eastern Orthodoxy. And I'm not gonna, like, sit there and be like, well, I mean, I'm glad you're saved, but you really picked the wrong church, and now I need to, lecture you on why their theology is wrong. It's like, no, it's like, you've accepted Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. Like, hallelujah. Like, that is a moment to celebrate. And whatever church you end up at, like, as long as it's a Nicene Apostles' Creed affirming, church, then, that's as good a place as any to start, right? Even if you don't, we all have our own, you've been through your own journey, I've been through our own journey, but any place that gets you started in that relationship, I think that's something to celebrate. So
Yeah, and I think, everybody, like you said, is on a journey. And I try to remind myself that where someone is on their journey today is not going to be where they are tomorrow or next year or 10 years from now. So,
yeah, no, I agree with that. Amity, I see you for the video listeners, they can see it. But the people would follow you on Twitter or X, I don't know what we're supposed to call it. It feels weird to call it X still.
it does.
But at Amity Lee 13 is where people can follow you. Is there anything else you want to plug before we hop off?
Yeah. So I am actually going to be traveling with Free to many state libertarian conventions throughout the beginning of 2026. And so if anybody is going to be in Georgia, California, Texas, Florida, North Carolina, Virginia, or at the national convention, I would love for you, anybody watching or listening, to find me, introduce yourself, and have a chat about liberty or anything else you want to talk about. I'd love to meet anybody in person who I'm going to see there. You're muted.
I'm unfortunately probably not going to make it to many conventions next year, but I guess I'll close with my plug that if you want to see LCI at conventions, the best way to do that is to, again, support our end of the year fundraiser. We're obviously going to prioritize things like Freedom Fest and the big, liberty themed conventions, but state conventions and the national convention are always on our radar. If you guys want us to come out there, we'd love to be as many places as we can, and to continue to produce shows and content like the conversation we had tonight. So again, libertarianchristians.com/donate. Again, every dollar donated between now and the end of December is matched. And even if you can't listen, everyone's at their own place right now, and everyone gives to different charities at this time of year. Even if you can't donate, if you could just do us a favor by, liking this stream wherever you're watching it, sharing it to as many platforms as as you can. And if you're watching on YouTube, subscribing to the channel. Those are really, impactful and helpful ways to support what we're doing as well. But Amity, this was a lot of fun. Really appreciate you coming on, and we'll definitely have to do it again sometime. Appreciate everything you do, everything Free does, and yeah, for all of you who are watching this live, I'll be back here again tomorrow night with our founder Norman Horn. I'm gonna say probably like 8 or 8:30. We haven't quite selected the start time, but subscribe at Biblical Anarchy or at LCI Official. You'll get the details about that stream. But that's all we have for you guys for tonight. As I always conclude by saying, live at peace, live for Christ. Take care.